That's different. Injustice! Injustice!
Yeah, I think what a lot of Canadians realized in the last few years is that our most fundamental freedoms actually come second place in our Constitution, in our Charter.
Mm-hmm. Nothing sharp, nothing basically at all in your pockets, nothing we need to worry about.
Bye, Daddy!
So the judge here in Alberta, and also I know other regions in the country like in Ontario, agreed that our fundamental freedoms to assemble, to gather, to worship, that those were in fact, they were impinged, they were violated by the government. But of course that first section of our charter says, the government can suppress our freedoms if it's demonstrably justified. And there is no burden of proof upon Dina Hinshaw or anybody else to justify their decisions. And so that's really what is a shame about all of this is the admission that your rights were violated. However, the government can do that.
Adam Sos here for Rebel News, and I'm standing just outside of the church of Pastor Tim Stevens. This is Fairview Baptist Church. Pastor Tim Stevens is one of the Alberta pastors who endured the wrath of authorities for daring to keep his church open throughout COVID-19. Now, if you've seen our reports before or seen some of the videos of the dramatic arrests of Pastor Tim Stevens, you might be saying to yourself, that's not Fairview Baptist Church. You're right and you're wrong. This is not the old Fairview Baptist Church. As it turns out, Pastor Tim Stevens' conviction and everything he went through, his Christian witness drew a lot of people in. So many so, in fact, that he had to go out and buy himself a new church. So they have moved to this new facility. Without further ado, we're going to head in, talk to Pastor Tim Stevens about the growth his church has seen, in addition to getting an update on the massive acquittal that has extended from the Ingram decision, which basically struck down the COVID-19 restrictions under which Pastor Tim Stevens was being charged, in addition to his church. So a massive legal victory. I'm here with Pastor Tim Stevens to provide you the details firsthand.
After we became convinced that that our church is essential, that the church is essential, and that we must gather, we met for a time quietly, peacefully, and then as police were notified and as they continued to come to our church, the tickets began to pile up, the court orders began to be issued, spending in total 21 days in jail, and then spending the last 2 years, working through the court system to see what would come of it in the end ultimately. And so very happy that now the last of those charges have now been withdrawn.
Yeah. Now, just looking back at some of the dramatic elements, I remember showing up when they just locked your church, the dramatic arrest at the church, when we made it to your house before police got there. That footage that haunts me to this day.
My daddy.
Bye, guys. Okay? We're gonna move, okay? Not too close, not too close.
Okay, guys, step back, please.
How brutal was that, and how surreal was that to encounter as a peaceful pastor, just in sort of creating an environment of inclusivity for people to gather for worship?
Yeah, I've had a time to watch, your footage, Adam, and I don't remember really the time that it was happening, but I've been watching it and seeing it. It is shocking how far we've come as a country in Canada, that could happen. Mm-hmm. And so it almost feels like for some of these things that have happened with the police coming to our church, with locking our building, with putting me in jail, it's almost like there's somebody else's memories in my mind of those events, because it's so surreal that has actually taken place.
Well, we're happy we're there to capture the memories, because not that they're happy ones, but they needed to be told. Before we get into the ruling, before we get into the legal stuff, maybe even a little bit of faith, a little bit of politics, you've got a big family. Going through that, being behind bars, it was tough on you, but it was undoubtedly tough on your big family. Do you have any sort of words for your wife after everything you guys went through together?
Well, my wife was incredibly supportive. The children were incredibly supportive. Our church family was incredibly supportive. And I think that's the one thing that maybe we ought to have learned through COVID-19 is not the role of the government to try to keep us safe, but the importance of family and of community and of strong marriages. And that's really what ties us together and helps us to endure times of difficulty. So, my wife did such a fantastic job with the children. And the children, as we worked through all this, we were careful to teach them why we were doing what we were doing, so that they were aware of that. And they know Christian history. Yeah. They know what happens when you take a stand for what is true, you might have to face the consequences, but you do so willingly because you're doing what is right.
Well, there's a sentiment throughout church history that sort of the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and that growth can occur through adversity. And you look at obviously the basis of our faith. You look at Christ on the cross, and it's called Good Friday, something so brutal, because good came of it. Perhaps if you can just talk a little bit, people likely noticing that we're not in the old Fairview Baptist Church and we're in a new building. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, after all that happened, and the attention that was really brought to our church, not that our message changed, but more people heard it because of COVID-19. And so as people began to join us, we just didn't have the space and the capacity. We were meeting multiple services and got to the point where, we need to find another facility. And so God wondrously provided this facility just north of downtown. And it houses us. We're able to resume our weekly meals together. And God did it in such a way that we didn't have to go into debt. There's no mortgage. He just provided. He took the loaves and the fish that we brought and he multiplied them. And it's a testament to God's faithfulness through this time. And I'm convinced that it's because of the decisions that we did make that were hard that the Lord has rewarded.
Well, it's incredible, and it's whether it's you or Pastor James Coates or any other pastors across this country, while the churches that shut their doors and agreed that church wasn't essential have seen their populations not return, the people are not coming back. The churches that said, no, we really believe in this, they are flourishing. Incredible to see that sort of conviction that we may suffer for our faith lived out. I know lots of people were inspired. So let's now talk about the Ingram decision. This was effectively, for folks out there who aren't aware of the ruling, a decision reviewing whether the sort of COVID-19 restrictions were valid, those restrictions implemented by the Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dina Hinshaw. And in essence, the ruling based on this one lawsuit, the individual Ingram, said that they understood that there were some violations. Those violations were okay, actually, that notwithstanding the fact that there were charter violations, that was okay. But the only issue was that there was additional political interference. So before we talk about the good news, if you could just talk about that, the fact that they weren't like this was fundamentally wrong, which I think most of us would agree, it was a technicality.
Yeah, I think what a lot of Canadians realized in the last few years is that our most fundamental freedoms actually come second place in our Constitution, in our Charter. Mm-hmm. So the judge here in Alberta, and also I know other regions in the country, like in Ontario, agreed that our fundamental freedoms to assemble, to gather, to worship, that those were in fact, they were impinged, they were violated by the government. But of course that first section of our Charter says, the government can suppress our freedoms if it's demonstrably justified. And there is no burden of proof upon Dina Hinshaw or anybody else to justify their decisions. It just came down to, well, they were duly elected and Dina Hinshaw was qualified to be the Chief Medical Officer, so it's okay. The judge has no bearing as a judge or no authority as a judge to say whether those health orders were right or wrong. And so that's really what is a shame about all of this is the admission that your rights were violated. However, the government can do that.
Yeah, and it's also, there's something just, again, surreal about this, because you'd think it would be the opposite way. Their concern was that an unelected official didn't have unbridled control and that elected officials were weighing in on public policy. That was their concern. That seems backwards. Beyond that, though, I know you were talking about in the past in interviews wanting your day in court, lots of proceedings. We've talked to members of the Justice Center of Constitutional Freedoms, Chad Williamson of Williamson Law, lots of them saying stuff was starting to emerge and suddenly there's no prosecution, everything's being acquitted. Is there any concern about certain abuses not seeing the light of day? Yeah,
it's hard whenever, and even other things like in terms of that app when you came into Canada, that was required, and that just kind of went away. The courts didn't really want to deal with it. And so the challenge is you still have these laws on the books. Yeah. And so there's nothing stopping the government saying, hey, this is a justifiable reason for us to shut down the churches and shut down the economy. And they can just do that. Yeah. And there's going to be no help within the courts. Thankfully, as a Christian who follows the Lord Jesus, we know that ultimately God is in control, and He and His holiness will be vindicated. But it doesn't seem that there's much help with our politicians or even with the legal system.
So now getting to what, I suppose we could call good news. You've had some illegal victories along the way. It has been trending in this direction, but with the Ingram decision, basically the Crown prosecutors have been like, we're not going to get a conviction. Acquittals across the board. Can you talk a bit about some of the legal victories leading up to this, and then ultimately the decision that came that everything was acquitted?
Yeah, for some of those charges that sent me to jail, the prosecution, as my understanding is, realized that they imprisoned me wrongly because the court order that they had, if you remember that court order with up at the Whistle Stop Cafe, they were using that as like a blanket court order to put anybody in jail across Alberta, and it just I was not named on there, and so. That was a gross overreach and abuse of their power. And so those charges were withdrawn.
Just for folks out there, on appeal, that was appealed, and effectively they're like, no, this doesn't apply. So that was a legal victory for sure.
Yes, it was a victory. And then there is also things that have to do with wearing a mask or, with social distancing or even the capacity limits. It was just sloppy how they prosecuted those things, so they didn't really have the data and the evidence that they required.
Right.
And so I was acquitted of some of those charges leading up to this one. This last one was more of a blanket charge against our church for months of violation of the Public Health Act. And so it would have been interesting to see how this would have played out in court, but I'm guessing it would have been the same way where, yes, your rights were violated, but they can do that because the government ultimately knows best.
Yeah. It's wild to see. Now, I suppose on that note, for you, I don't know if there's any considerations. Obviously, you've got a new church, you're in good shape, but are you going to be seeking remuneration from the government? Is there plans for actions? I know this is the question on everybody's mind right now, but spending all that, we've seen pastors spending collectively months behind bars, horrible experiences endured, the like we mentioned off the top, that video, the heartbreaking video that we put on the side of a truck and drove up to a number of venues to remind people what happened. Is there going to be consequences for this government as a result of that?
Yeah, I'm thankful for the number of lawyers that have represented me and others across Alberta. So Leighton Gray and his law firm have been so helpful. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms have been incredibly helpful to us. And they're the ones who are actually pursuing legal action against the government on my behalf, filing for charter damages for unlawful arrests. For both of my arrests have sent me to jail for a court order that didn't even apply to me. And each time when I was arrested, I would tell the police, this doesn't apply to me. And they would say, well, and they always, we'll handle that later in court. But of course, that's all been withdrawn. And so the Justice Center is going to continue to pursue that, and we'll see what becomes of that.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to hear. I know lots of folks have said, well, we're thinking about it. It's great to hear that there will be action. I'm sure many others will be following suit. Pastor Tim Stevens, I want to thank you so much for allowing us to share your story this entire time and for always being available for an update. And as always, for everyone at home, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Sos. Well, many Albertans are happy to be receiving at least partial good news, not worried that prosecution against them will continue with the massive acquittals resulting from the Ingram ruling. Unfortunately, in other parts of the country, the news is not so good, and some people are still in for the legal fights of their life. One person who took a leadership role in pushing back against pandemic restrictions is Tamara Leach. Unfortunately, she's not in it alone. The Democracy Fund has agreed to crowdfund her legal fees, and if you want to chip in, you can do so at helptamara.com.